Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this afternoon's session. My name is Ian Fegley. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement here at the Forum for Youth Investment. We're based in Washington, D.C. We are a national nonprofit, nonpartisan action tank that works to combine thought leadership on youth development and cross-sector partnerships and developmental youth practice with on-the-ground training, technical assistance, and supports. Every year, we convene the Ready by 21 national meeting, which brings together more than 500 national, state, and local leaders who, like you, are committed to improving partnerships, policies, and practices for children and youth. We are really excited to announce that the 2018 Ready by 21 national meeting is going to be held in Palm Beach County, Florida, on April 18th to the 20th. Every year, there are dozens of stimulating workshops and sessions from top leaders in education, policymaking, advocacy, and out-of-school time. To share the expertise of these leaders and inform the field of youth development, we recently launched this free webinar series featuring the best content from recent Ready by 21 national meetings. Today's session is on social and emotional learning for staff and leadership. We're going to explore how the Anchorage Youth Development Coalition engaged executive directors, managers, and frontline staff in a 10-month social and emotional intelligence leadership experience, one of the first of its kind. The session is being recorded and will be sent to all of you as soon as it's posted. All lines are muted to avoid any background noise, so please submit your questions using the chat feature. Our presenters today are Sierra Johnson and Ann McKay-Bryson. Sierra works with the Anchorage Youth Development Coalition, where she leads initiatives to unite Anchorage organizations for improved youth outcomes. She brings experience in youth work, experiential learning, and community development from organizations across the U.S. and abroad. Ann McKay-Bryson is a lifelong educator with over 30 years of experience teaching in K-12 classrooms and leading adult professional development in Anchorage. She has worked as an SEL professional learning consultant for CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, since 2012, serving the Oakland, Reno, and Anchorage school districts, and facilitating national. Ann is the lead author of the DESA Strategy Guide and provides consulting services to out-of-school time agencies. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Sierra.
Thank you, Ian. And as we get started, I just wanted to confirm that you can see the start to our presentation here.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, great, thank you. So thank you everybody for joining us. We're gonna actually pop on video here to say a quick hello from Anchorage. So I'm Sierra and this is Ann, and we're calling in from Anchorage Youth Development Coalition office on a wintry already day. And we're excited to have you all joining in with us. Today, we're really gonna be focusing on, well, first I'll share a little bit about my role on this project. Ian talked a little bit about our backgrounds. I've been in a project manager role, helping to bring together Anchorage youth programs to focus in on social emotional learning, not just at the youth level, but for staff and leaders as well. And I'll have Ann introduce herself.
It's been my pleasure to work as someone who provides resources and acts as a thought partner to Sierra and her team as they have been developing and then building out the sustainability for this great project. And we just want to thank Ian and the Forum for Youth Investment folks for inviting us to adapt our conference presentation into a shorter webinar version. We are going to take a few reflection breaks where you get a moment to pause and think and contextualize your learning, and we'll ask you to do a little writing in the chat box as we go along.
Great. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the project that we've been working on with our different youth program partners, to know a little bit about how we came about creating it and what it looks like, as well as draw some connections to the work you're doing. And hopefully some of the ideas we'll be sharing will be things you are able to take back or integrate into your thinking with your staff and leaders in your organization. So thank you again for joining us. Just make sure I can get the slide here. So the agenda for our call, a little bit later, we'll come back to talking about how some of the things we are doing on our call today model some of the same practices that we integrate into our work. It, as Anne was saying, is going to be adapted. We're going to co-create this space with you, being virtual. Some of the things that would typically be more partner or small group work, we're going to utilize the comments box and polls instead to engage everyone. And there will be an opportunity for questions and answers toward the end of the call. So we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So to begin with, to put a little bit of context to what we're going to be talking about, there are really 4 layers to the work that we've been doing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. And as Anna said, we'll take some different breaks to draw some connections and give you a chance to make some connections to the work you're doing. To begin with, and Ian, when you're ready, if you could go ahead and share the poll we had put together. We want to start by recognizing that this is a webinar, and often we have a lot of competing demands sitting in our offices with our computer screens, our phones, lots of different distractions around us, and wanted to give you the opportunity to be able to identify what it is that you hope to get out of this webinar experience. And this, you'll see a poll in front of you with 5 different social and emotional learning competencies, and we invite you to choose 1 or more that you would like to give extra attention to during this webinar to help you engage. So they are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And we'll get a little bit more into each of those areas later in the webinar.
Looks like we've got about 2/3 of people have participated so far. Give everybody about 15 more seconds. All right. We'll close the question now. Here are the results.
Thank you, Ian. So it looks like the highest rated was responsible decision making, but really across the board, people are choosing to give attention to each of these areas. I know myself, in presenting, self-management is one that I'm going to be using to both manage what it is I hope to share with you, the technology in front of me, and things going on here and outside my window, looking into our wintry scene. Not quite as beautiful as the slide in front of you. Okay. So to begin thinking about the work that we've been doing, I wanted to start with what I think has brought many of us onto this call, and that is a focus on youth. And so our goal, although we've talked about this being a professional development initiative that's focused on adults, staff, in the end, we of course are looking to impact youth. And to tell you a little bit about the youth here in Anchorage, sometimes it's surprising to people to learn that Anchorage has some of the most diverse schools in the nation, ethnically diverse that is. I think we had the #1 most diverse high school in the past few years. And that comes from there being people from a number of different homes, home countries, hometowns around the United States, as well as abroad, including refugees, people from the Pacific Islands, people from just all across the world. And it would be hard to describe some of the really wonderful experiences we've had with the many different people here in Anchorage. So I'll just add one more interesting fact about our community, and that is that in our school district, we have 90 different languages spoken by students. And this project in particular was focused on supporting youth from Alaska Native backgrounds and funded by a tribal nonprofit organization. So among those many languages and among the many people that we work with, that has been a specific focus. And when we think about supporting all of those youth from all the many backgrounds that they come from, we've gone to look at research to find out what is it that makes the most difference. And this will be familiar to many. We have the developmental environments, relationships, experiences, and space and time. This comes from the Readiness Project that looked at when we want to improve outcomes for youth across the board, whether it be reducing negative outcomes or improving positive outcomes. These are key things that we all do in youth programs in different sectors that make a difference. Similarly, you may have seen this in the Weikart Center's Youth Program Quality Pyramid or other work that talks about, specifically in youth programs, how do we create those environments and relationships that make a difference for youth? And so there was a lot of interest here in Anchorage in learning about how could we do this better, and particularly in thinking about the movement to incorporate social emotional learning more into the work that we do. People started to ask, well, we want to do this for youth, but how do we do this as adults? How do we model social emotional learning skills? How do we model those relationship skills that are going to support youth throughout their lives, in school, in jobs, in creating the life that they have outside of school? And so there are many youth program quality training in specific areas like building relationships, creating safety, resolving conflicts. But there was a lot of interest here in Anchorage in saying, how do we do that across the board? Not in any particular content area, but in the skills that we bring that fit into social emotional learning. So this framework that you see in front of you comes from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. And you'll see the 5 competencies listed in the middle are the ones that we had in the poll today. There's skills listed next to each that we'll have a chance to get more into later. And this has really become the focus of the work that we've been doing, looking at how do we support ourselves as youth workers, as program managers, as executives, in bringing these skills to our work to create relationships and environments that support youth to thrive. So when we realized that was the interest, there was a lot of readiness in our community to do that work, we wanted to look outside of Anchorage, across our state, across the US, to find out, was there already work being done out there? Was there a model for how to support professional development for staff in these different areas? And so we had phone conversations, and we did a literature review, and we brought up presenters that focused on different areas of relationships and environment and social emotional learning. And what we found was that though there are some exciting professional development initiatives out there, much of the social emotional learning work was being done in the corporate world, some of it starting to be done in the education world. But we did not find a lot focused specifically on youth development and out of school time programs and how we bring those social emotional learning competencies to our work there. So we'll talk a little bit more about the project from there, knowing that there wasn't something existing, but there was a lot to build on. One key component of that process of building this initiative was the team of facilitators that we engaged, community partners from across Anchorage, different backgrounds who had experience as executives, as frontline youth workers, as managers, in looking at what relevant curricula was already out there and what does Anchorage need and what would be relevant for our programs. And I think you'll find that much of what we've been doing may apply outside of Anchorage, but we really did want to take that local lens, particularly knowing that we were focused on not only Alaska youth, but Alaska Native youth, and specifically in Anchorage. And then we asked the question of who would be the right people to engage in this initiative, especially as we were beginning to pilot something new here. And we reached out to organizations looking for a diverse representation of different types of programs, so not just traditional after school, but also other sectors. And I'll give some more examples of those in a minute. And the organizations that engaged were those who were most interested in social emotional learning, most excited to get involved in this in some way. And we're willing to commit staff, not just at the frontline youth worker job position level, which is often where we're seeking professional development for staff, but also committing executive directors and high-level managers to being part of this initiative so that conversations and change in organizations in this area was happening for everybody. We know that it's hard to, just as we want youth to see these skills modeled, and it's important for us as staff to be able to do that, it's also important for our leaders to be able to do that as well.
Take a first pause break. I'd like you to think about some connections that you're making now to your own work. What is this making you think about related to the needs that you have or the work that you're doing in your own work? So think for a moment. What's this making you think about relating to your own work? And we would invite folks to take the next couple of minutes and type some ideas into the chat box. We really appreciate all the thoughts that folks are sharing with one another and with us, and we can see some definite themes that, regardless of our geographic dispersion, that we're all working in very similar ways and have some real that we're trying to address. We're looking forward to getting other thoughts from you as we go along. So thanks again for sharing in this chat box, and it'll be there for you to reflect on again as we move through this work.
So the image that you see in front of you now comes from a publication called Preparing Youth to Thrive, Promising Practices for Social-Emotional Learning, that was done by the Susan Crown Exchange and Leichhardt Center. And I pulled this image here to talk a little bit about our work, even though this publication was focused mostly on how do we support social-emotional learning for youth. The same metaphor applies. And so here in this image, you see youth supported by adults or facilitators around them working on a project. And so when we think about social-emotional learning, for example, that we looked at just a little while ago, the way that we're approaching supporting those could sometimes and needs to be sometimes explicitly talking about those competencies, but it's definitely not heavily focused on, for example, getting up and doing lectures on each of those 5 social-emotional competencies. And instead, it's really focused on looking at experiences that we're having in life, work that we're doing together, and practicing some of those skills, and also reflecting after having those opportunities on how those skills played a role and how we can use them differently in the future. And so when we think about, it's easy to see this metaphor for youth of doing some sort of project, an after-school program or at school. And when we think about adults and the different organizations in particular that we brought together that are focused on multiple different areas of supporting youth, we wanted to find a way to make this type of experiential learning happen and make it relevant to all of those different stakeholders. And so we were able to find topics and youth work that cut across the various sectors. Some of those sectors that were included were, as I mentioned, after school, but also runaway and homeless youth shelters, youth mental health, juvenile justice, Alaska Native education. And that was in our pilot year. Now we're moving into a second year that's included some of the same stakeholders participating again, but also new organizations as well. And so finding areas that all of these organizations could connect with and staff, both at the front lines and executive levels, could connect with, was part of our challenge and opportunity in that development process of looking out there at what are some of the key topics and movements going on in youth development work. And you'll see here a list of some of the areas that we found most relevant in talking with our facilitator team and the team that developed this project. These are topics that stood out. Each of them is connected with an SEL competency focus, because of course none of these is a training on those topics, but really an opportunity to get to the reflection and focus on each of those SEL competencies. So for example, we have one of our sessions this year focused on cultural responsiveness. And really that's presented as an invitation for people to explore that topic, to draw some connections to exactly what that looks like in their own work and their role. And then afterwards to make connections to, in that month, in each of these topics, all social emotional learning competencies are relevant. So it's not so much about that connection as it is providing an opportunity to really focus in on each of those competency areas and starting that off in a way that's not abstract, but really relevant to the work we all are doing on a day-to-day basis.
One of the things that we knew as we developed this session of this series of monthly meeting sessions was that we wanted to highlight both the importance of the familiar, having a real rhythm to the sessions, and also freshness, having the content in the current context of our own work always come into the sessions. It was of high value to us that we incorporated the same core components in the work that we did in our facilitation team development meetings as we did in the sessions with the agencies, so that we were developing these skills and using them and modeling them with one another, just as we would be doing in the agency sessions. So to keep that familiar and freshness that you saw Sierra share with you the idea of what the content would be for each session, we also incorporated the 3 SEL signature practices into all of the sessions. So always starting with an inclusion activity at the beginning where everyone's voice is heard, that's connected to the work of the day, and then looking at engaging practices like the reflection time, partnering, small group work, mixing a combination of reacting to videos or print content, and also drawing upon each other's expertise using listening circles or consultancies, and then some explicit SEL skill building connected to that, and then always having an intention time. So you're seeing before you a guideline of the components that we carefully planned into every session, hopefully in a seamless kind of way. So as you think about what Sierra just described to you in terms of the content and then these core components, I'd like you to think about, what do you notice? What's interesting to you about what you're just hearing and seeing? And what questions do you have now? Think for a moment. And then type those comments and questions and areas of interest into the comment box.
And there's been a few, these are all in-person meetings, correct?
Yeah, I can speak a little to that. So you saw probably in that last slide that each of those topics was associated with a particular month. So these are in-person meetings that happen. In the first year, it was 10, and then this year we found that it made sense to reduce it to 8. But they are monthly meetings that happen, bringing together staff from each of those different organizations. There are multiple cohorts focused on the executive level and one focused on practitioners who are more involved in day-to-day operations. We have begun to explore how might we be able to share not only the materials and resources, for example, like some of the things we've brought up on this webinar, but also the experience itself. When we did this presentation at the Ready by 21 conference, we connected with Communities and Schools Atlanta, and I see some of their staff are on the call today. The connection we made with Communities and Schools was a great catalyst for us to start thinking about, how could this look outside of Anchorage, or how could we provide support beyond the direct work we're doing with staff here. And so we've begun to put together resources to be able to experience and draw connections more virtually, and are excited to be doing that in partnership with Communities and Schools Atlanta. So this having been piloted for the first time this past year, we are still in that exploratory phase of how could we be doing this beyond Anchorage, but it has been exciting partnership work to start looking at how could these resources be useful to others.
I'll speak to a couple of the other questions as people are adding things in, and then we'll have more Q&A time later too. One of the things somebody asked about was how individual goals are introduced, or how individual needs are met. And the group has set for themselves a personal goal and an agency goal that they really want to be working on this year, and that they will use their explicit SEL work to help in the solution of that. They also have time during every meeting to work in partnerships or small groups in thinking about and reflecting on those goals and their progress toward them. One of the questions was, how are you doing the explicit SEL work? I'll touch on a couple of the ways that we're doing that. We've had the EQI last year and the EI 2.0 this year. That is a resource for people to do some self-assessment on that, and then bring the part of that they would like to share into the group discussions. And we've also been creating some resources as we go along, including some questions specific to the SEL skills that then people can, in their partner talk, address how they are specifically responding and growing in that particular area. The last one I'm going to address right now before I pass it back to Sierra is somebody asked which competencies adults tend to most struggle with. And it took me back to the poll at the beginning when we were saying, which competency are you most going to focus on during this? And there were people in every single competency that this is something to focus on. I'd say that tends to be true also in the things that we're struggling with and wanting to grow, that it's really across the board in all 5 competencies, because it's where we are in the moment, in the work, in that situation. So they're all important and they're all intertwined.
An additional note on this lay out as some of the core components of each of the sessions in our monthly series is that they were intentionally designed this way to happen on a monthly basis in order to create the opportunity for reflective practice. And Anne was speaking to that some as well, that there are a lot of professional development offerings that we go to that are one-time or one-day experience, and then we hope that we go back and have some sort of accountability to bring that into our work or support to do that. And doing this on a more ongoing basis creates the opportunity to not only do learning in those sessions but also go back and practice some of a new perspective or a new approach during the month in between, and then come back together and build further. And having that happen simultaneously for both executive and high-level managers as well as frontline staff helps to build relationships across the organization. And we have intentionally built in connections for those groups in between sessions so that there's a conversation happening, not just within that peer group, but within organizations as well. Next, I wanted to share some of what we learned in our pilot year. We, of course, as I mentioned, are already into a second year of rolling this out, and we're able to integrate a lot of participants in our first year to make this second year better. So we did evaluation at a few different levels. We had monthly feedback that was telling us about the quality of learning experience that participants were reporting. We had a pre and post assessment that was focused on social emotional learning competencies and gave us some data on where people were at before they started the series and where they were at the end. And then we also gathered feedback in a more open-ended way, asking participants at each level to talk about what some of the greatest benefits to them and their organization had been, what some of the improvement areas were, et cetera. And I've added in just one quote from one of our executive cohort participants. We recently were able to get an analysis of some of the more quantitative data, particularly from that pre and post assessment, and look at what changes did happen. And with these social emotional learning competencies, it was interesting because it's not always just about moving up the scale. Of course, we do want to continue to build and grow skills, which for adults, and for adults, we peak in these skills in our 40s and 50s. And so it really is a lifelong learning process, and not something where, at some point you're probably going to take a social emotional learning assessment and be done with no more room to grow. And in addition to wanting to make that steady progress, there's also the concept of balance among all of our different competencies and how we can often rely really heavily on one or more of them to get us through things and not have the opportunity to grow in the other areas. So we analyzed both, how was growth happening across all of these competencies, but also how was balance increasing. And we were really pleased to know, having piloted this, not knowing for sure if this, although we were basing this on promising practices, on work that had been done elsewhere, we really didn't know for sure that this is going to provide the support we're looking for. And we were pleased to learn that it did, that we found participants did increase not only in the of social emotional learning competency areas, but also the balance among those different scores. And we also were able to compare that to a comparison group of participants who were not able to complete the series or did not attend on a regular basis, and were able to see that there was a difference. Those who attended and participated fully in the series had a statistically significant increase in skills and in balance among skills. And for those who didn't participate, the changes were far fewer and at a much lower level. So that really indicated to us that there was something promising going on here. And so we've gone into the second year. We've taken a lot of the open-ended feedback to help improve the series. And we've really integrated that set of core components that Anne was talking about consistently into each of our sessions. That was something that took a while for us to stumble upon the right way to present that relevant experience for people to learn from, to draw connections to exactly what's happening in our work, and then to do a reflection on specific SEL competencies. So I saw a couple of questions pop up throughout the webinar so far that I think this will get to a little bit, asking about what about supporting youth SEL. And there's been more work done, especially in education out of school time, focused on youth social emotional learning, these key skills that go by so many different names, whether it be employability skills, 21st century skills. And what was interesting to us and really critical to the success of what we've been doing was that many of the same practices that we are learning are important for youth are also the practices that we use to work effectively with adults, not only for professional development and learning focused engagements, but also for meeting engagements and planning processes. So when we think about the inclusion activities, the engaging practices, the optimistic closings that Anne mentioned, we would use those in environments with youth, but those are also the same practices that we used with our cohort participants in the core component theme. And what we haven't spoken to as much so far today is that we also use those same practices for ourselves in our meetings. When we were doing the development of this project and putting together the curriculum, that is how our meetings were formatted. That's how learning supports were provided to our team. And it's been incredible to see our progress over the past couple of years in how well we work together, how well we communicate, and how efficient we are in just short periods of meeting time in getting our work done. And much of that really is owed to the environment that's been created with these SEL practices, in addition to our own social emotional learning as project staff and facilitators throughout this process. So when we look at all these different layers in this project, just taking it as an example, we really are wrapping around youth as the center of our focus, thinking about how do we support youth in building social emotional learning skills themselves, but also how do we create the environment and relationships that are going to support more than just social emotional learning skills. They're going to promote positive outcomes, reduce risk behaviors across the board. And as we provide those supports to ourselves as staff and leaders around youth, and then as support team networks across the community, across the country, we can use these same practices to really foster that experience for youth, for staff, for leaders at each level.
This is our last pause, think, and write moment. And to anchor our learning, I'd like you to think for a moment about what do you most want to take back into your next conversation with colleagues? What are you thinking about now that you most want to continue this conversation about? And take a moment and type that into the chat box.
I've seen quite a few questions come through about how you're measuring staff competencies and staff growth in SEL.
Yeah. Give just a couple more seconds for folks to think about their writing, and then we'll start the Q&A with that one. So this project is a SAMHSA money, and it's funded through the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, CITC, here in Anchorage, who have been just very proactive and generous funders of adult SEL in the Anchorage community over the last decade. So that funding allowed in year one for us to use the EQI, which is an internationally normed tool of great longevity. We had a highly respected, trained researcher coach who helped folks debrief and analyze their results that first year. So when Sierra was sharing with you the growth measurement that we've been able to identify, that was on that highly respected research-based tool. So that was year one. Year two, less money. And so what we're using this year is the 0.0 little white book you've probably seen in an airport sometimes, but it's actually got a great opportunity for some personal self-assessment. One of the sessions really helps get people into the book and help making their own goals. And that's what they use to set their personal and agency goals this year, and then continue to touch base on that throughout the sessions.
And then to evaluate the project, we did in that first year use that same data from the EQI assessment as our pre and post. That's not how it's designed as an evaluation tool, but we were able to take advantage of having that data in that way. And then this year are doing some different types of pre and post surveys. In the future, actually this year, also going to the level of getting youth feedback on changes that youth experience in environment and relationships to help us know not only are we experiencing change in those who participate in our series, but are youth actually seeing that impact the environment where they're interacting with staff. So Ian, I think we can open it up to other questions that have come up in the chat box.
Yeah, there have been many. I don't know if any have stood up particularly to you. There's been a pretty numerous number of questions kind of around the nuts and bolts of those monthly meetings. Are they kind of ongoing? Do you have to participate in the entire series? Could staff drop into some of them and not others? How long were they? How did you get people to kind of dig deeper to not only talk about what they were doing, but to kind of get reflection in those meetings?
Great. So with the nuts and bolts, it was important for participants to attend each of the sessions, and it was not opened up in a way where people could drop in as needed. Of course, that's a challenge, especially for a lot of, for staff at all levels, but to find the time and make that commitment each month. We did spread it out on a monthly basis as opposed to every week or every 2 weeks, though knowing that to make sure that the ask of staff was not too time intensive. But just in the data itself, in our evaluation, we were seeing the difference between staff who really could attend regularly and those who didn't. So that consistent participation was important, and one of the reasons for that was the relationships that were built over the course of the year. These were cohorts made up of staff who did not work together on a day-to-day basis, and even those who did work day-to-day may never have had the opportunity to build this type of trust relationship together. And so creating that sense of belonging in our group and a real sense of trust and confidentiality also connects to one of those other questions that came up about how do you get that environment created that helps people dig deeper. I think the flow of the sessions was also part of helping everybody dig deeper, and starting with that big picture idea of here's something we want to talk about in our work, like trauma-informed practice. And now here's an opportunity to think about what does trauma-informed practice look like in my agency, or what's a challenge I have with making that happen. What's something I really connect with as an individual. And now here are some explicit ways for me to tie that to skills that are strengths for me, and also that may be areas for growth. That idea of including both strengths and opportunities for growth is also part of that, supporting people to dig deeper. All of our sessions are really, I think it's easy with social-emotional learning to go straight to a fixing place, that the reason we're interested in this is because we see problems, because we feel like youth or ourselves that we're not managing our emotions, that we're struggling in some way, and wow, these competencies could really help us. But that with a fixing mindset is a really challenging environment, and not one that helps us open up and really be ready to grow. So having that strength focus throughout everything, always starting in that place, and making this really about, we're all professionals in this space together, and we're here to work on these professional skills that are key to our work. One quote that comes from that Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book, and I'm paraphrasing here, but is that over half of our performance in any job comes from these skills. And so keeping it focused on that, and that this is professional learning like in any other area. Those are some things that really, I think, helped us create an environment that people want to be a part of, want to build relationships in.
That really leads into another thought. Several questions have popped up about the cohort idea, and I just can't say enough about Sierra's brilliant design, which I think was really incredibly valuable to have role-alike cohorts, so that the people that you are talking to in your group, you might be the only one or two of those people in your agency, but here you are talking with people who share the same role, some of the same challenges and excitements from around town. But then to participate, you brought people allowed, so the executive directors not only attended, but they also had their managers and frontline staff folks participate in the cohorts. So when they went back to their agency, you had 2 and 3 streams of participants at different levels of the agency who could connect with each other about it, and really heighten the possibility that the work would get embedded in the actual agency work, as well as being a very powerful personal experience.
I thought, and that's true, we have some, a cohort that's got both frontline youth workers, but also program managers. And even in that group, we have people seated in a way where there's an opportunity to get to know a subset of the group on a regular basis that are more role-like peers, so that you don't have supervisors talking to supervisees about some of these challenges, and people feeling like their job is on the line in the conversation or anything like that. A nuts and bolts item that I had also that you had mentioned, Ian, was people were asking about the length of these meetings, and they're 3 hours in length, including we provide lunch as a support, knowing that people are coming from a busy workday.
So it looks like another kind of general theme that was, mirrored and echoed by the communities and schools team in Atlanta, which is one of the reasons why, we decided to have this webinar, is they just spoke so highly of this and how it really changed and transformed a lot of the work that they're doing. And it seems like from the list of comments, you've got about another 250 people that feel the same way and really want to get started with this kind of work with their staff. everyone's asking for the materials and the resources that you use, we'll provide as much as possible after today's session. But I wanted to raise a question, kind of what would you do differently? What would you advise? What would you, for people starting this kind of work, how would you advise them to get started, or what would be your key lessons learned?
Well, one thing I would say to that is, there are, whether it be resources from our project or from elsewhere, I think more and more is becoming available. There's a demand for this. I've heard a lot of people raise this same question that came up in Anchorage of, if we're supporting social emotional learning for youth, we ourselves as staff, as leaders, need to ask these questions of ourselves of how are we bringing these skills into our practice. And at whatever point you get started on this work, something that we learned was the value of really including everyone in the process. Making this something that is owned by those who are leading it, by those who are participating in it. From early on, we brought partners together, or if it's within one organization, bringing staff and leaders together to talk about this, so that it's a very inclusive process for everybody.
Great. And did you have any further thoughts on that?
No, I think that's always a question. You're like, can you send us the stuff? Which is, we all do that. We talk about from early in educational and out of school time careers, steal shamelessly but selectively, and get the things that work for us. So one thing that Sierra and her team have just been very diligent about, that really sets it apart from other grant projects that I have worked on, and worked really hard to capture their process and their materials. And so at the end of their grant cycle, they'll be in a really great position to share that in a very open way. I think between now and then, I definitely don't want to speak for you, so I'm turning to Sierra in terms of how to access resources. Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we've really, as I was mentioning, started to explore with Communities in Schools Atlanta. It's been an exciting partnership, and the way that we've been working together, just as an example, to think about, how could we share more of what we're doing if people are interested in learning, is we created a plan for work together where a core set of staff from Communities in Schools Atlanta got to experience some of the foundational elements of our series. And then we've been working at a distance to help them experience the full series. And then there will be an opportunity for us to provide additional supports that are focused on looking at that experience that everybody's gone through as participants, which is a key part of learning, and switching to the facilitator lens of how do you now think about leading this with your staff. So that's the approach that we've been taking together. Some of the materials, of course, on this presentation will all go out in the PowerPoint following this call, and we would be really interested in exploring how this can be of benefit to others as well. And Anne was saying we are beginning to document and build these supports into something that goes beyond our own team here.
So a question came in from Maria. Is there any plan to measure youth competencies and start making links between staff and youth competencies going forward? Our
current evaluation plan is focused on the program quality level, knowing that there's so much in the research already about the links between program quality and skill development for youth. But I think it's definitely of interest, and we have included a couple of evaluation questions already that do focus on social emotional competencies to see if we pick up any data already on that. It's tricky since those skills do build over time, and so the process of several months that staff are involved, the time it takes for that to impact the environment, culture, and shift for whole organizations and change over time. But I think we may start to see some of that youth skill development shift even over the course of that time.
It also depends so much on the size of the agency. When you're looking at impacting the adult SEL competencies and use of SEL skills, if you're talking about 5 people from an agency of 30 employees, that's one thing. But when you're talking about a place like Campfire, that is a huge agency, the dosage factor also comes into play if you're thinking about getting measurement around youth skills. So that might be another grant, another time.
One other question that Katina has sent in twice. Can you repeat what your goals are concerning getting youth assessment of the experience?
Yes. Our goals are to understand, and I'm just starting to advance the slides a little because I recognize we're closing up on time, so I'll respond to this question and then we'll do a closing for the webinar here. But the goals for our assessment are to understand first how are adult competencies changing in social emotional learning competency areas, which is our goal of these sessions, and then how is youth experience of the environments those adults work in changing because of this. So how is the environment changing, how are relationships changing, how are engagement experiences changing for youth. Okay, so the slide up in front of us you saw earlier today focused on the social emotional learning competencies and some of the skills associated with each. Again, this comes from the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, and is the framework that we've used to guide our series. I wanted to ask everybody in the comments box here another opportunity to look at these skills and think, what is one skill that you have used today in engaging on this webinar? And when you've identified one skill here, so that would be one of the small bullet points around the outside ring, type that into, we invite you to type that into the comment box to share. And as the responses come in, naming many of these skills, just point out that just here today in this experience, we've had the opportunity to engage with some material, start to draw connections to our own work, and do some explicit reflection on the social emotional learning skills that we're bringing to the work that we do in all of the many places that we're calling in from to this webinar today. So not only is this work for the people you support, but this work is for ourselves too, and we're excited to have gotten to connect with you in this way. We have one final poll for you as we close up, just to hear, how you found this of value. So the question is, I am interested in using information provided during this webinar in my own work or the work I want to be doing. Here once we get the majority of responses in.
About halfway, about half of people have responded with a extremely large preponderance of strongly agree and agree.
That's really good news. Ann and I were talking about how this feels like a pretty vulnerable question to ask in a public way, but is an important one and when we want everybody to know, how are others using this information, or is this something that's going on in other communities, that there's excitement about this. And it seems like the answer is yes, and we're excited to be part of the work. So Ian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. All right, so